This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Connecticut's tax policies are blamed for making the state economy stagnant and causing residents to flee. According to trendct.org, from 2011 to 2015, 76,000 people, or 2.6% of the population, have moved to another state, often for the South. Supporters of tax reform in the state say Connecticut's troubles only got worse when it adopted income tax in 1991. This Sunday is the 25th anniversary of the legislature's vote, what was described as razor-thin approval back then, and caused so much anger among locals that 40,000 residents traveled to the Capitol to protest later that year. How do you feel about Connecticut's income tax? Do you think the state is worse off because lawmakers approved the tax 25 years ago? Actually, were you even at that protest in 1991? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/where we live. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. In studio with me to talk about the history of our state income tax is Carol Platt-Liebau, president of the Yankee Institute for Public Policy. Did I get it right, Carol?
Oh, pretty close. It's impressive.
And also joining us by phone is the former comptroller of the state of Connecticut back then, Bill Curry. Hi, Bill.
Great to be with you.
I'll start off with Carol. Let's talk about the income tax and, how big of a boon has it been for Connecticut?
Well, it's been a big boon for Connecticut state government in a lot of ways. Since 1991, the state's taken in $126 billion. And so obviously for state government, it's brought in a lot of money. What it's done for Connecticut's people is obviously a much different question.
And so you're with the Yankee Institute, obviously one of the groups that's been advocating tax reform. Tell us what went wrong with this proposal when it was first introduced and when it was passed, and any broken promises to residents here.
Sure. We're advocating not just tax reform, but really spending reform. But one of the things that went wrong was that along with what you correctly characterized as razor-thin approval for the income tax, came along this promise that there would also be a spending cap. And what the spending cap was intended to do, at least the way it was presented to Connecticut's people, was it was intended to make sure that spending stayed within sustainable levels. In other words, that politicians in Hartford didn't get hold of a new pot of money and then just go and blow it. And we all know how that ended, don't we, Lucy?
I want to bring Bill Curry into the conversation. Take us back to 1991, Bill.
Well, as you mentioned, the 40,000 people who showed up at the state capitol. Lowell Weicker, who was the object of their fury, actually went out among them. I remember very specifically that he was spat upon during that encounter, and the state was just split deeply about it. The charge among the conservatives was that Weicker had run saying that he wouldn't enact an income tax, and that's true. One of the things that every new governor gets, though, in Connecticut, or many new governors get, is the surprise that the previous governor was lying about the deficit. And so you get into office. It happened to Dan Malloy. It happened to Al Grasso. Certainly happened to Lowell Weicker. There was a huge state deficit, a bipartisan sense that they'd come to a real Armageddon then. And that created the context in which the tax was proposed and finally enacted. And I think that my own feelings about it were deeply mixed at the time. And I give Lowell Weicker enormous credit for the courage of what he did in enacting the tax. And I agree strongly that it is a necessary part of a template for any tax structure to work fairly. That's why 43 states have one. I would say, though, that there was a great promise made to the working middle class. And in this sense, Carol and I think, may agree some. But the tax raised the tax put a 4.5% wage tax essentially on all income, while cutting from 14.5% taxes on passive income, dividends, interest, capital gains. And so a lot of the money raised actually went to a tax cut for the very well-to-do. And one of the first mysteries was how we very quickly got back into fiscal trouble. people said, "Wow, you've just gone after my paycheck," and the state's back in crisis just a couple of years later. I just say one other thing very quickly, and that is that for me the biggest problem was that for years people like me had promised voters that an income tax would include tax relief along with spending reform, that it would include reductions in what I saw as the real culprit in our state tax structure, which is the property tax, which falls so heavily on cities, small towns, small businesses, working families, and we had promised people that and the regressive sales tax would be reduced as part of an overall package, and instead we reduced those taxes on the very wealthy, with promises we would fix it in the future. And this is the 25th anniversary, and we still haven't.
Well, yes, and as we know, the wealthy, as Bill puts it, are some of the most mobile people in the country. And there are lots of states that welcome them with open arms. And what we've seen is a really significant outmigration. 237,000 people net have left the state, taking with them $13.7 billion in taxable income. And they've gone to states where they feel welcome. And, at first the income tax was supposed to be relatively flat. Now we have a number of different structures. They've gone up from 4.5% to 6.99% at the highest. And, Bill, as you know, Connecticut has the second heaviest tax burden in the entire United States. And it would be one thing if we all looked around and saw, in a sense, a utopia with beautiful roads and, infrastructure galore and all kinds of wonderful things. But, sadly, none of the promises that really undergirded the calls for the income tax have ever materialized, as you point out. And I understand why the people of the state are unhappy. I mean, look at us. Now we have the highest state debt per capita in the United States, and we have the second highest unfunded liabilities per capita in the United States. And so it's hard to figure out exactly what the voters, the regular working people of the state have gotten for the $126 billion that's come to Hartford.
Let me just say a couple of things, Carol. First of all, as I mentioned, when we enacted that 4.5% tax, somewhere between a third and a half of the revenues went to bringing down tax rates by 2/3 on those same very wealthy Connecticut residents, and apparently that wasn't enough to keep them. But I'm always skeptical of those migration figures. Whenever a fireman retires to Florida, it's for the weather, and whenever a wealthy person retires to Florida, it's because of our tax structure, according to this debate.
Well, these numbers, Bill, are taken from census figures,
but the census doesn't tell you why.
No, of course the census doesn't, but it does. When tell you.
When GE moves to Boston, they say it's for our tax structure, and then it turns out they never paid any taxes.
But
and it's a perfect example of the fact that people move for different reasons.
Bill, GE was also worried about the unfunded liabilities coming down the pike, and they knew what it would mean for them if they stayed. They knew what it would mean in terms of taxes, given the massive unfunded liabilities.
They precede the income tax, by the way.
And Bill,
okay, let's not talk over one another. Let's hear from Bill, and then we'll go to Carol.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Bill. Bill, you can finish.
I just want to say that, again, GE is a perfect example, and you can say, well, they were worried about some other taxes that somehow they'd be cornered into paying someday. I kind of doubt it. And I agree that I think that some of this is true, by the way. I just think that it's overstated. Many people on the again, I think the Yankee Policy Institute has been one of them, has talked about the related the question of economic growth to the tax and the stagnation in wages. But wages have stagnated in all 50 states for 40 years, for instance, well before Connecticut adopted an income tax. And it's very hard for me to connect these problems in an empirical and logical way. I do
Bill,
think that the property tax we pay in this state, on the other hand, is easy to connect to economic problems. And they aren't the economic problems of the super rich and of large corporations, but of the small businesses that produce two-thirds of the jobs. And that part of the promise that we would bring down the regressive tax on the poor, the sales tax, and the tax that is so regressive to the middle class and to small businesses and homeowners, the property tax, our failure to keep those promises, I think the sales tax affects consumer demand to some degree, and the property tax is an overwhelming burden on the middle class. And so I think that what this state needs to do is finish the job. Part of the problem here is that they did only half of what they were supposed to do, and the half they didn't do, as so often happens, was they didn't keep their promise to the middle class. And the promise was that tax reform would include property tax and sales tax reform, which would be a relief to the working middle class. And we didn't do it.
Bill, can I ask, this is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. On the phone is Bill Curry, and in studio, Carol Platt-Liebau. What about the promise for the spending cap? I mean, aren't we in a worse situation now than back in the 90s in terms of this looming deficit?
We absolutely are. And if I could just circle back to something Bill said, the fact is that when you compare the states with the nine highest income tax states versus the 9 zero income tax states, the zero income tax states had more than 7% higher job creation. They had 12.3% higher personal income growth and a gross total state product of 6.2% versus 4.6% for the high income tax states. So I just wanted to clear that up.
But they also have higher sales tax, right?
They do have higher sales tax. But part of Connecticut's Bill, may I just finish for a moment?
Yep, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Part of Connecticut's problem is that we have high taxes in every category. So, for example, Florida has a property tax, although it is lower than Connecticut's, but it also has no income tax, no death tax, and we're the only state in the entire United States with a state gift tax. So it's the overall tax burden and the explosion of spending, Lucy, as you were talking about. As you know, I'm sorry, may I just throw out...
Real quick, because I want to get to a call.
Sure. The fact that since 1991, state growth in state spending totaled 187%.
Josh from Guilford, you're on Where We Live. Josh.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
So I'm listening to this, and this has been frustrating me for a while here. It seems like we're at a race to the bottom with other states competing with over our tax structures and our tax rates. I would like to point out that Connecticut, for all what the woman from the Yankee Institute talked about, with the low tax states, we have a really, really high quality of life here, and places like Arkansas just don't. And, we pay for that. And so she makes it sound like we're living in a dystopian society, which we're not. That's one. Number two, as far as the tax burden is concerned, the places who have these small and very low tax rates, they need to start paying their own way, because blue states, on average, like ours, send back more money to the federal government we get back, and those states get more. So we're actually paying for them. And then lastly, how long do you think those states are going to have their low tax rates with this explosion of growth of people who want to go there because they have lower taxes? You've got people coming from places where they expect services, and they expect places like South Carolina to be nice. I know there are nice places in South Carolina, but a lot of the state is not nice at all. And then finally, one last point, I think Bill Curry has talked about this before on your show, is, with the tax problems we're having in Connecticut and the budget problems we're having in Connecticut, these are not only Connecticut's problems. You've got a huge problem with corporations who are not bringing their tax money back to the United States, and they're not paying their own way. They're not paying what they should be to help the society that's helped grow them. And you've got money parked in Ireland that's never coming back here. And unless we can get a hold of, and they're playing all of us off of each other. I mean, whatever the GEPR people were handing out to smoke must have been pretty strong, because they were leaving to go to Boston because there's 300 colleges there, and they're trying to remake themselves as a tech company. And all these other arguments that they made are just distractions, and were just designed to get that the tax subsidy. So these arguments that I hear are pretty specious from the Yankee Institute side, considering we have a very, very high quality of living, probably the highest in the United States, and Arkansas doesn't. So if you like the taxes down there, go have it.
Well, it sounds like you appreciate living up here, Josh. Just real quick before I let Carol respond, we have looming deficits in the future. I mean, how do you want the state legislature to deal with that?
Well, I think that it's a bigger issue than just the state legislature. I think it's a national issue because we do have that Hunger Games type competitive race to the bottom situation with corporate taxes, and that allows these huge corporations that are basically stateless now and as powerful as many countries' governments to play each state off each other for these tax rates that basically do not exist. For instance, GE, I think they paid $250 minimum tax here for a corporation. And so there needs to be reform at the federal level, because as long as we allow these companies to not pay the taxes due in the United States, we're going to have these revenue problems. And I would point out that
all right, Josh, we're
going to make the argument to the Eisenhower 95%. No company paid 95%. They spent their money so they wouldn't have to pay the tax, just like a small business owner, which I am, spends out some of my capital at the end of the year to buy equipment that I need and ends up putting the money back into the economy.
All right, Josh. Well, thank you for your call. And, he said that we need federal reform, but we may be waiting a long time for that. Carol,
I was going to say, and while we wait for the federal reform, of course, we have some pretty significant deficits. After the $600 million shortfall that had to be resolved this year, in 2018, we're looking at a $1.3 billion deficit. In 2019, that goes up to $1.5 billion, and in 2020, $1.6 billion. So, I love Connecticut. Everyone at Yankee Institute loves Connecticut. That's why we live here. We want everyone who wants to stay here to be able to do that. The problem is that, when you want to debate quality of life, talk to the 237,000 net people who have voted with their feet and taking $13.7 billion with them. The fact is that there are some sensible things that we could do that would make our state more competitive, make it easier to open businesses, to grow businesses. There are even a couple of taxes that could be eliminated that would benefit
You're talking about the death tax?
I'm talking about the death tax because, the death tax took in $168 million in 2014, which was less than 1% of all tax revenues. But do you know how many affluent older people leave the state because they figure that I'll live for 6 months and a day in Florida where there is no death tax, come back, enjoy the beautiful quality of life in Connecticut over the summer, and not get hit in the end for gift taxes and death taxes?
I want to let Bill Curry get in here on the conversation. Bill, obviously, you had mentioned that there needs to be, more reform in terms of property tax relief. It's been 25 years since the income tax was implemented. Where does Connecticut go from here?
I think there are 2 points I just want to respond to one thing that point Carol was making earlier, and that is the idea that we have the highest taxes in the country and the highest business taxes.
Hold on.
That isn't what.
And it's sort of like, at least I thought, if I didn't hear correctly, but we, we don't, and those numbers have been manipulated. I don't mean by the Yankee Policy Institute, but they've been manipulated in debate over years. It's kind of like you hear this mantra that the United States has the highest corporate tax rates in the world. Even Democratic senators have said it many times, and it's simply not true. We're in the bottom half. We have the highest nominal rates, but we have so many loopholes and gimmicks in our tax code that we're not even at the median, never mind the very top. And so when all of these numbers, it's like GE announcing they're leaving for the fiscal problems, and they've never paid any taxes. I don't know if you changed, if you changed a small tax in Connecticut, that it would have any influence on migration of the wealthy or of anyone else. And these seem to be problems of regional economies that we're encountering. The second thing I just want to say is that spending reform, and there are a lot of things that are actually here we agree on. It's why I actually worked back then. The two votes that came over were Bill Nickerson and Reg Jones in 1991. And they were both from Greenwich, and they knew that their constituents in Fairfield County would actually pay less taxes if we put this particular plan in effect. And they were also great on spending reform. And, When I was comptroller, I fought to put the state on the generally accepted accounting principles. The governor said he would do that when he ran. Governor Malloy. Still hasn't happened. We have this habit of spending money, of borrowing money to spend on current expenses rather than genuine capital investments. And our whole approach to how we deal with spending reform, there are certain things you can do with waste, fraud, and abuse is the mantra that you hear over and over again for years. Our biggest problem is healthcare spending, and our second biggest problem is ethics. The degree to which our corrupted system spends money it doesn't need to, and the degree to which we have failed to deal with healthcare reform. And those are two areas where we could bring down spending substantially with continued applied attention. And so we need to do all that. And lastly, I have a little mantra of my own. I tell people you can either change the rule or write the check. And part of what a tax code should do is change the rules. And we say that changing tax codes can help revive an economy. And it's true. I don't think it's true in the way Carol thinks it's true. And I probably don't, and I certainly don't think it has quite as much effect as she does. But if we brought down the property tax and did a set of other things, brought down health care costs and other costs of doing business for the small businesses that get all the lip service and none of the actual service from either party, that everything I know about economics says that would be the way. And those aren't the people who leave. They're not just nomads who pull up their corporate tents like Pfizer here. After you give them everything and they move the jobs. Invest in the people who are invested in us.
If I
and
might.
The parts of the tax structure that affects them the most overwhelmingly is the property tax.
Okay, Bill, we're almost out of time, and I just wanted to thank you again. You guys make talking about tax reform interesting. Bill Curry, former comptroller of Connecticut and Democratic political analyst. Thank you for joining us, Bill.
Oh, my pleasure.
And Carol, real quick.
Well, sure. There are a lot of things we can do to get Connecticut back on the right foot. The first thing we really need to do is to reform public sector employee compensation just to bring it in line with what the private sector makes. We've got good state employees here, and they want to help. They want to do the right thing. So let's just bring everything into balance in terms of the way they get paid. Lots of money in streamlining social services, and we can encourage economic growth by reducing our regulatory burdens, reducing occupational licensing, putting in a few structural reforms that are not hugely complicated, but even things like fixing state employee salaries by statute rather than outsourcing it, zero-based budgeting. There's a way forward, Lucy, and we can find it if people just stop the crazy spending in Hartford.
And I believe all the seats are up this November in the state legislature, so get out there and vote. Carol Platt-Liebau, president of the Yankee Institute for Public Policy. This Sunday, the Yankee Institute's holding a brunch at the Sheraton Stanford Hotel, marking the 25th anniversary of the Connecticut income tax, with special guest Grover Norquist, founder of Americans for Tax Reform. And we'll have details on our website about that. Thank you so much for your time, Carol.
Always a pleasure, Lucy.
This is Where We Live. When we come back, a conversation about Brazilian identity. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Latino USA is focusing on Brazilian identity for this Sunday's broadcast here on WNPR, and their reporters focused on interviews with Brazilians living in New England to find out whether they consider themselves Latinos. Joining us through ISDN is Marlon Bishop. He's producer for Latino USA, and he joins us from the studios on 125th Street in Harlem. Marlon, welcome to Where We Live.
Thanks for having me.
So why did you decide to focus this episode on Brazilians and how they see themselves in this country?
Well, at Latino USA, our show is about the Latino experience in the United States, and often during editorial meetings, we would have a story that would come up about Brazil or Brazilian Americans, and we'd ask ourselves, well, Brazilian Americans, I mean, is this part of what we're covering at Latino USA? And often we weren't sure. And so we decided to finally dedicate an episode to kind of look at the Brazilian American community and hear stories from the Brazilian American community kind of, just in time for the Rio Olympics, and talk a little bit about those kind of ways people identify. And
why focus in on New England?
Well, the entire show is not focused on New England, but New England is a place where the majority of Brazilian Americans live. There's huge Brazilian American communities in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in New Jersey, in Connecticut. I believe Danbury, Connecticut, is the second highest percentage of Brazilian American population in the country, almost 5%. And so we also wanted to, go to the places where Brazilian Americans were, and kind of New England is that place.
Latino USA shared some tape with us from that episode, again, airing Sunday. Here's Natalicia Tracy, Executive Director of the Brazilian Workers Center in Boston, an organization that helps Brazilian immigrants with job placement. And we're going to hear her speaking to the idea that Brazilians came to New England for a reason, which is this long-standing Portuguese presence.
Historically, this is a place where the Portuguese settled, right? Cambridge, Somerville, and many other parts of Massachusetts have been a corridor for the Portuguese to settle. And we have this idea that if you are from Portugal, because of colonialism, that you're going to have, language affinity and cultural affinity.
So, Marlon, Framingham, Mass. is somewhere that Massachusetts, that has like a hub for Brazilian Americans. You find a lot of them there?
Absolutely. Framingham, in our episode, we have a piece about Framingham, kind of a profile of the town. And, just bouncing off what Natalicia just said, the reason that so many Brazilian Americans and so many Brazilian immigrants ended up settling in New England is because there's this long-standing Portuguese presence in the region, in addition, and actually Lusophone presence in general, Cape Verdeans as well. There are many in New England. And that has a lot to do with maritime trades, which many Portuguese immigrants were involved with, and New England was a place that they settled. And so when Brazilians started coming in kind of larger numbers, especially in the 80s after and during and after the dictatorship, they ended up going places where exactly there would be language affinity, where there would be, it would be easy to settle because people would be able to understand them. And so now you have places like Framingham, which, is the center of a region called Little Brazil, and in Massachusetts, where you can find Brazilian stores and bakeries and businesses everywhere. And, as is the story for immigrants all over the United States, people go often where they feel like they'll be comfortable at first.
You mentioned bakeries. There's a great place in P-Town, a Portuguese bakery. So just, again, that history of these people coming here and having a life here. We also hear from Natalicia Tracy saying that Brazilians are a newer immigrant group. What does she mean by that?
Well, what I was kind of saying a second ago is that Brazilian aren't a huge community in the United States. There's somewhere between 300 and 400,000 Brazilian Americans in the U.S. And, there's been a varied migration history, but a lot of Brazilian immigrants arrived in the 80s. And so you're kind of having a community that is still very much growing and, is still planting roots in a lot of ways.
And we're going to hear her talk about this next generation forming a new kind of Brazilian American identity.
And I think that will continue to create space for people who are here. The conditions in Brazil are sort of forcing more and more Brazilians to really think about staying and what it means to stay, instead of just being a guest worker or a student, but really what it means to become an American and move away from my country.
Marlon, can we talk more about, now how Brazilian Americans, how they see how they identify, and, do they consider themselves Latinos?
Well, it's a complicated question, as we found out. In a lot of ways, one of the things we did is we sent out reporters to ask people on the street, basically, in different areas where a lot of Brazilian Americans live, in Newark, New Jersey, and in Somerville, Massachusetts, and asked people, how do you identify? Do you identify as Latino? And we got all sorts of answers. There were people who said, absolutely not, no way, I'm Brazilian. There were people who said, of course, we're from Latin America, we're Latinos. So I think it's a complicated question in a lot of ways. There are definitely major kind of cultural similarities between people of different Latin American backgrounds. But to begin with, Latino is kind of this catch-all term that really includes people from a really wide variety of backgrounds. You have Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, and people from all sorts of backgrounds who are grouped together on this umbrella. And I think for a lot of Brazilian immigrants who are new to the United States, they're kind of confused why that happens. And I think for people who have been here for a little bit longer, they kind of get used to it. I remember one person that we spoke with said, well, in Brazil, we don't have this concept, so why would I identify as Latino? And so I think part of that is kind of how people identify has a lot to do with their context, of course, and the kind of American context of how we talk about race and identity is very different from how it's talked about in Brazil.
When they say that, we're all Brazilian, does that play into this myth that there's, a racial democracy, that Brazil, no matter the tone of your skin, that they're all equal?
So Brazil is famous for kind of having this attitude of racial democracy. Indeed, there's ways in which that is true. There is a great pride and love for Afro-Brazilian culture, for example, in Brazil. There is a real valuing of that root, but at the same time, there's tremendous inequality in Brazil that can be seen.
I know from our producer, a few weeks ago, we had spoken to Bishop John Selders, who is a Connecticut resident and one of the leaders of Moral Monday Connecticut here, a Black Lives Matter activist, and he was able to go over to Rio before the Olympics. I understand he's also in the episode of this Sunday?
Yes, that's correct.
And you also spoke to other activists like Waltrina Middleton. I'm reading here she's a preacher as well as an organizer and founder at Cleveland Action, a human rights resource in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Again, Latino USA was able to share some tape, and here Waltrina is speaking about her perceptions after visiting Brazil and meeting Afro-Brazilian activists there.
A lot of the sisters and brothers we met were just so excited about us being there, but their connection with their African roots and heritage and the boldness in the ways that they embrace their heritage and their roots and the love that they have for their Blackness, that pride, is something that we still fight and struggle for here in the United States as Black people.
On the flip side, Marlon, how do the activists in Brazil feel about the Black Lives Movement here?
Well, one of the pieces on our show is about kind of this resonance between Black Lives Matter activists in the U.S. and people kind of fighting for racial justice and police reform in Brazil. What that's about in a lot of ways is that there are very, very strong parallels. Police violence towards Afro-Brazilian youth is a major issue in Brazil. The kind of rates of police killings are far higher in Brazil than they are in the U.S. And, these group of Black Lives Matter activists went to Brazil specifically to meet with a group called the Mais de Maio, who have come together. They're mothers who have lost children in police shootings in Brazil, and kind of finding ways to kind of internationalize that struggle and realize that it's not just based in one place. And so that is, I think, something that was very interesting for us to think about.
Before the Olympics, again, I know this program we focused on, because of the spotlight on Brazil in the lead up to the Olympics, maybe there would be some impact on the social justice issues happening in that country. What's your take?
Well, I think it actually, the impact that there was also kind of complicated. In Rio, there was something called pacification units that were put together by the police that were kind of meant to, quote unquote, clean out the favelas with the idea of kind of liberating them from drug gangs. And, that was a move that was applauded by certain sectors of Brazilian society. But, what that meant in reality a lot of times was, heavily armed police units going in and, kind of guns blazing. And a lot of people got killed in the crossfire. And so that was definitely a kind of, complicated human rights question.
You have to wonder, with all the money spent on the infrastructure in the lead up to the Olympics, how any of that will trickle down to the people who are living there in poverty.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I haven't particularly studied that issue, but Brazil has kind of major inequality problems. There's a small percent of the population that is fabulously wealthy, and a very large part of the population that is not been included in those kind of economic gains. And there have been major gains for the kind of working class in Brazil over the last decade. There are millions of people have seen their incomes rise to what is called the classe C, which is a kind of, I guess, a lower middle class in Brazil, but a consumer class that had never existed before. But Olympics are not, Brazil is in a deep recession right now, and some of those gains have been lost, and that's been very hard on working class Brazilians.
I want to thank Marlon Bishop. He's a producer for Latino USA. He joined us from the studios at 125th Street in Harlem. Again, Latino USA airs Sundays at 9 p.m. on WMPR. And this weekend, the episode focuses in on Are Brazilians Latinos? Thank you so much, Marlon, for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, it's the NFL preseason, and next we're talking to a Super Bowl champion. You'll know him if you're a Packers fan. I'm talking to you, Colin McEnroe. George Kuntz Jr. joins us to talk about life after football. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, from caring for a family member with Alzheimer's to supporting a relative with a disability, caregiving can take a toll on your physical and emotional health, and it also impacts your finances. On the next Where We Live, we'll explore caregivers who live in Connecticut and find out who, if anyone, supports them. That's tomorrow. Coming up right now, the NFL season kicks off in just 3 weeks. Fans are gearing up to tailgate on Sundays, digging out the jerseys from the closet. Some are even building their own fantasy football teams. But is all this obsession justified for such a violent sport? We've heard a lot recently about the long-term effects concussions can have on players in the NFL, among other athletes and other franchises. But the brutality of the sport takes its toll in other ways, as well as many players who struggle to build a new life after they retire. Here to talk about life after football and America's obsession with the game is George Kuntz Jr., former NFL player, Super Bowl champion, and co-author of the book, Is There Life After Football? Surviving the NFL. George, welcome to Where We Live.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So currently you're the Vice President of Advancement at Marian University, that's right?
Yeah, well, senior, I received a promotion about a couple weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Yep, Senior Vice President for University Relations.
So you were a linebacker for the Packers, so you've been able to have a good life after football?
Well, yes, but yes and no. My quality of life isn't the typical life that a 47-year-old, 48-year-old would have if they did not play football. So I'm dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, and I'm trying to make the best out of it.
So as a linebacker, a lot of hits and a lot of joint issues after football?
Yep, a lot of hits, a lot of joint issues, a lot of head trauma. Had about 11 concussions, documented concussions that I played when I played, and now that's starting to take a toll on me. You know, when you see the collisions on Sunday or Saturday or Monday night, you see everything from an external, but also there's something going on internally, and more times than not, it's the brain, and the brain is moving around inside your skull, and you really don't see the effects of that until later on in life.
So you've had health challenges after retiring from football, but you were able to launch into a new career.
Yes, I always wanted to get into the administrative side of things, not necessarily the coaching, but I always wanted to see if I can work behind the scenes and give players, give student athletes a chance at the American dream. Because if it wasn't for a football scholarship, I would have never had a chance to go to college. So I'm so indebted to the individuals that donated money to the university that I went to. They thought enough of me and saw the talent in me to offer me a scholarship, and that was at East Carolina University. And I was so fortunate that I was able to go on and receive a degree, and I liked school so much, my mom told me to keep going.
And so you have a sociology advanced degree, right?
Well, yep. I have a PhD in sociology, master's in sports management, one of two Green Bay Packers. I think we've had the Packers been playing football since 1919, about 7,000 men to wear the green and gold, only two to go on and receive a PhD, and I'm very fortunate to be one of them.
So why did you think about co-authoring this book about focusing on is there life after football?
Well, when I was going to grad school at Marquette University, and I was having a conversation with some professors, and the topic came up about your dissertation. What are you going to write your dissertation on? And I said that whatever I write my dissertation on, hopefully it can make change. So I said, well, I love to talk about the issues and the challenges one goes through when they leave the NFL, because we've all heard the horror stories that the average football player plays 3.5 years, and 24 months after he's done, he's financially broke. And I just wanted to write about a lot of the success stories, some of the not so good success stories, and try to put a roadmap together for the parents, mainly for the parents who's going to be deciding whether their young son is going to be engaging in the sport of football.
Let's talk about life in the NFL bubble. What does that mean, and how does that impact what you were saying, where many of them leave their career and then they end up being financially broke?
Well, the bubble, I would say, is a controlled environment. From the age of 9 years old, I entered into a bubble, and that bubble lasted until I was about 32 years old. I was given a scholarship. I had trainers taking care of me. I had academic advisors. I had tutors. I had financial planners as I got into the pros. So a lot of the things that the ordinary person, or let's say my classmate who so happened didn't play sports, didn't have access to. And then when the bubble burst, I was forced to learn how to balance a checkbook. I was 32 years old and didn't know how to balance a checkbook, and I think that's uncalled for.
Mm-hmm. Remind me what year you retired, and how have you seen any outreach to these young players once they're done with their careers? Has it changed at all?
Well, my first year was 92, and I played until 2000. I've basically been out 15 years. I think there's a plethora of information available from the colleges and from the NFL and from the different professional teams. But the thing about it, the players have to be willing to accept it. The players have to be able to seek that information and that knowledge out. It's hard to tell someone when you're 21, 22 years old that they need to start a 401k or annuity. A lot of times I've been striving, working for 20-something years to get a bite at this apple, and I want to do what I think I should do. And because a lot of them are first generation, and we know there's nothing wrong with being first generation, but when you're first in your family to go to college, and you're first in your family to go to the National Football League, there's going to be some pitfalls along the way, and more times than not, a lot of those players, they hit those pitfalls.
Mm. So you're saying when you're a professional player, you're in the moment, you're living each day, you're not thinking about the future and what happens when the career is over.
Right, because each player thinks they're going to play 10, 12, 13 years. You're young, you're strong, you're fast, you're mean. So all of them think they're going to play, 10, 12 years, and the unfortunate news is that they're only going to play 3.5. Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking with George Kuntz Jr. He's a former NFL player, and he co-authored a book, Is There Life After Football? Surviving the NFL. He played for the Packers, Super Bowl champion. You have that ring. Can you talk a little bit about, when we think about the problem of concussions and all of the research and science that has come out, this is a very violent sport. You mentioned it earlier that you've had some effects from your concussions. Is the NFL doing enough to help players, or is it just this make the big buck and people will keep tuning in each fall?
I think so. I think that the research is getting better and better each year. I don't think it stops at the door of the NFL. I think we have to wind back the clock a little bit more and go back to even Little League football and Pop Warner, middle school and high school. I think that if there is blame, I think there's enough blame to go around. But I think the NFL is doing a tremendous job of putting in different protocols when a player start going through the whole concussion issues and problems. They have now a protocol that they must go through and they must adhere to. So I'm very, very happy to see that the NFL has stepped up, because there's going to be a trickle down effect down to the college, high school, middle school, and Pop Warner Youth Football League.
Do you think that Americans' obsession with football, it hurts the impact of trying to be more proactive about caring about these pro athletes when they retire?
Well, I think so. I really believe so. I think that the NFL, I think football, high school, I think that's the fabric of our great nation. I think it's the number one sport, but also too we have to do some things to take care of our players as well. And that's going to happen. It's going to take some time. It didn't take this didn't happen overnight. I think one of the reasons why it's happening because the players are so much bigger, faster, and stronger than let's say back in the 60s and the 70s. But now we just have to figure out how to slow it down just a tad and take the head out of the game. We have to take the head out of the football game, whereas when I was younger and learning how to tackle, I was taught to lead with my head. No longer that's the way you should be taught to play the game of football. And football is going to be fine. It's just going to take a couple of years to get everybody on the same page.
We're almost out of time, George, but just two questions for you. First, advice for parents who, love the sport and want to see their children play in football, and then your advice to current players who are planning to retire.
Well, to parents, please, by all means, give your son, and in some cases, give your daughter a chance to play, because I think that I really believe the positives outweigh the negatives. I played with numerous guys that never had a concussions. So please let your kids play, and just make sure you have a good coach that's teaching them the proper technique in tackling. To the player that's currently in the National Football League or in college that has the promise of graduating from college with their football scholarship, or if you're on the Division III level and you don't have a scholarship and you're looking forward to graduating, just make sure you play as hard as you can, but also study as hard as you can as well. Find that passion, that same passion that you have running around on the football field, or that same passion that you have in the weight room. You have to find that same passion that you can impact your community and help people. Always remember, give back to someone, help them to achieve their dreams.
And when the football career ends, take that same passion into a new career, and that they can do it?
Yes, they can do it, without a doubt.
I want to thank George Kuntz Jr. His book is called Is There Life After Football? Surviving the NFL. He's currently, tell me again your title at the Fond du Lac?
Yep, Senior Vice President at Marian University.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me. And now that the interview's over, I thought I'd tell you that I grew up a Steelers fan.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, God. I'm glad you just gave me heartburn.
Thank you so much, George, for your time.
All right, bye-bye.
Our show is produced by Lydia Brown and Jeff Tyson. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. Special thanks to executive producer Katie Tolarski. You can continue the conversation on our website, WNPR.org/wherewelive. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.